Good evening. I am Trevor Alonso. This Halloween happens to be a special one, as this year is the 125th anniversary of the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. Stoker was loosely inspired by Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler has been visioned as a monster to some, but is a hero in his homeland. Here is a brief history of Vlad the Impaler.
Vlad the Impaler was a 15th century historical ruler with a well-earned reputation for savagery. Even hearing the name conjures up two grisly images: thousands of screaming innocents impaled on giant wooden spikes in the fields of Eastern Europe, and shadowy Transylvanian noblemen drinking blood in decrepit old castles. But there is an awful lot more to this brutal Wallachian ruler than fanciful legends about ancient counts and bloodthirsty vampires. So let's strip away the terrifying myths and reveal the even darker truths behind Vlad the Impaler, thought by many to be one of the evilest men of all time. By some accounts, his total number of victims rises as high as 100,000, many of which were killed in unimaginably horrific ways, and overseen personally by Vlad himself. Vlad's forces were never the largest, often coming in at around 24,000 strong. But he compensated for this by building a brutal reputation across all of Eastern Europe as a man who must be feared and respected on pain of death. To be captured by Vlad's forces often meant being tortured to death with extreme prejudice and mounted like a trophy outside his territory to scare off any encroaching enemies. If you were lucky, he'd kill you before the worst of the mutilation began, but few people who fell into the clutches of Vlad the Impaler could count themselves as lucky. This is a man so bloodthirsty that rumors circulated about him literally drinking the blood of his slain enemies, believing it would grant him strength. While doubt has been cast about whether he ever actually dipped his bread in the blood of his impaled victims, it's a testament to his character that stories like these are entirely believable, considering he made the habit of looting, burning, and slaughtering whole cities if their inhabitants dared to defy him. If he ever actually did drink blood, it probably wouldn't even rank among the top 10 of his most awful atrocities, especially considering other acts on this list include running people through on huge wooden spikes, total dismemberment, and in some cases even skinning enemies alive. For a man who practically seemed like a monster in human skin, you're probably wondering how could he rise to power? Well, like many of history's most terrifying rulers, Vlad the Impaler was quite literally born into it. Born in Wallachia, a historical region in modern Romania, between 1428 and 1431, Vlad the Impaler was actually the third Vlad of the House of Dracula, and that's a name that probably rings a bell, thanks to the Irish Gothic horror writer Bram Stoker, but we'll get back to that. Back during Vlad III's era, Wallachia was caught between two ruling families, his own, the Draculești, and a rival house of nobles, the House of Danești. These families both descended from the House of Basarab, who founded Wallachia, leaving their descendants with a claim to the throne over which many bloody Game of Thrones-style wars were fought. When you're a ruler, especially a ruler of an embattled territory like Wallachia, it's important to build yourself a strong reputation. If you wanted to be taken seriously, the fastest way to do that is to make a grisly example of someone. And thankfully for Vlad, he was an expert at making grisly examples, particularly of the Transylvanian Saxons. These Saxons, unlike the British Anglo-Saxons, were German migrants and traders who'd settled in the area after it was conquered by Hungary in the 12th century. Vlad's first point of contention with the Saxons was a religious difference. The Saxons were Catholic, and Vlad, a deeply religious man, was a follower of the Roman Orthodox Church. However, the true impetus behind Vlad's horrific treatment of the Saxons was a question of loyalty. The Hunyadi family, who ran the military wing of Hungary, were at odds with the nation's monarchs. The Transylvanian Saxons were supporters of the Habsburg King of Hungary, whereas Vlad's loyalty lay with the Hunyadis, who'd helped install him to power. In 1457, John Hunyadi's widow, Erzsébet Szilágyi, was the target of Saxon protests. Vlad happily helped Szilágyi's forces rampage through some Saxon villages, where they looted and burned the homes of the people suspected of organizing the protests. This ended up being a bigger headache for Vlad than he had initially imagined. The Saxons responded to his violence by supporting two challengers to his throne, Dan III and his own half-brother known as Vlad the Monk. This caused an escalation in Vlad's violence when his efforts at diplomacy fell flat. Vlad declared all-out war on his Saxon challengers and burned several villages of key Vlad the Monk supporters to the ground. He also struck against Dan III by wiping out his village of Bod near Brasov. This particular offensive was where Vlad coined his greatest trademark. The few prisoners he took during the battle, he had brutally impaled at the city of Targoviste. And if you picture this implement as a sharpened stake forced through the chest, as many sanitized depictions tend to show, you're both kinder and less imaginative than Vlad the Impaler. In his method, victims often had a slightly duller spike forced up their anus and left there. Over the following hours, and if you're really unlucky days, your body weight would force the stake further into your abdomen, at which point it would horrifically displace your internal organs. It's a gruesome way to die, and thus makes an incredibly effective psychological warfare tactic. He was sending a strong message. If you mess with Vlad, your fate is on the spike. But that's far from the only sadistic method Vlad employed in dispatching his enemies. He was also rather fond of having his men literally hack their victims to bloody pieces, such as in the Saxon city of Talmesh, and even having people boiled alive in huge cauldrons, as he enjoyed doing to Saxon merchants who didn't follow his trade rules. He handed out brutal executions like candy, having 41 students impaled just for being suspected of subversion. Many accounts have it that Vlad enjoyed dining among his field of impaled victims, perhaps as a power move to further his reputation as a terrifying enemy. And this perception worked. Vlad continued to rampage and slaughter through Saxon forces until Dan III was finally in his clutches. In a truly gangster move, Vlad forced Dan to dig his own grave while a priest read him his own funeral rites. Dan was then decapitated and buried, eliminating yet another threat to Vlad's power. After this, Vlad, having thoroughly subjugated his Saxon enemies, decided to call a truce. A far more formidable enemy was on the horizon, the powerful Ottoman Empire, headed by the late Sultan Murad's ambitious and ruthless son, Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed sent a detachment of emissaries to Vlad in order to essentially negotiate his surrender, but that wasn't how Vlad Tepes rolled. His confidence bolstered by his new alliances with the remaining Saxons and the forces of Hungary, Vlad literally had the emissaries' skull caps nailed to their skulls to send a message. Mehmed was successfully provoked, and all-out war began. But Vlad organized a series of vicious guerrilla conquests, splitting his enemy into small groups who'd covertly and ruthlessly attack larger Ottoman strongholds, breaking them apart from within. Vlad's most infamous act followed shortly after, when Sultan Mehmed, enraged by Vlad's victories, sent a powerful force of 60,000 men with the top-of-the-line armor and weaponry straight into Wallachia. Vlad was outnumbered and outgunned, but there was one factor that Sultan Mehmed didn't take into account. He may have been stronger than Vlad, but nobody was more brutal. He staged a terrifying night attack on an Ottoman encampment outside Tergoviste in 1462, where he took 5,000 men. When the full might of the Ottoman forces arrived shortly after, they discovered that Vlad had mounted all 5,000, in addition to 15,000 other Ottoman prisoners, on his trademark spikes. This grisly display would later be dubbed the Forest of the Impaled. To the invading Ottomans, Vlad seemed less like an average ruler and more like an inhuman monster, the kind of terrifying legendary figure who makes a perfectly logical inspiration for the world's most famous vampire. Mehmed ordered his forces to retreat the next day. The troops' morale just couldn't survive seeing 20,000 of their countrymen turned into rotting shish kebabs. The Ottomans came to know Vlad as the Impaler King, an iconic nickname that would live on in different forms for centuries to come. Vlad continued his bloody reign on and off for the rest of his life. Even when he was deposed and imprisoned for a time, he was later released by his captors to once again wage bloody war against the Ottomans. He'd slaughter, impale, and dismember his enemies with glee all the way up until his death, when he was killed defending his beloved principality from Ottoman invasion in January of 1477. For many modern Romanians, Vlad is still revered as a powerful ruler and a good man to his citizens, though to his unfortunate enemies like the Saxons and the Ottomans, you'd be forgiven for thinking he was the most evil man who ever lived.
Bram Stoker definitely took history and myth and wrote this into his book. But the vampire myth started in the 11th century, mostly from not understanding decomposition. As when someone dies, eventually the fluids start to come out the mouth. When uncovering bodies under mysterious circumstances, blood can be seen at the mouth, so people misunderstood this as vampires. Dracula wasn't the first vampire book. In fact, the book Carmilla was a big influence on Stoker. Now, how did Dracula become so famous? Well, I found a clip that explains this perfectly.
The novel, upon release, was only a moderate success in its day, nor was it even Stoker's most well-known work, mentioned only briefly in a 1912 obituary. But a critical copyright battle would completely change Dracula's fate and catapult the character into literary renown. In 1922, a German studio adapted the novel into the now classic silent film Nosferatu without paying royalties. Despite changes in character names and minor plot points, the parallels were obvious, and the studio was sued into bankruptcy. To prevent more plagiarism attempts, Stoker's widow decided to establish copyright over the stage version of Dracula by approving a production by family friend Hamilton Dean. Although Dean's adaptation made drastic cuts to the story, it became a classic, thanks largely to Bela Lugosi's performance on Broadway. Lugosi would go on to star in the 1931 film version by Universal, lending the character many of his signature characteristics. And since then, Dracula has risen again in countless adaptations, finding eternal life far beyond the humble pages of his birth.
There has been many plays about the Count, one of which I have a clip from the writer himself, David McCall-Blue, and he explains why he wrote the play. Now, Dracula has been in many books, good and bad. Some have been bizarre. Dracula has also been in comic books. At one point, there was an attempt to make him a superhero. Oh boy, it's hard to make him a superhero. Universal Studios has even put out a comic book or two. I even had a Dracula coloring book / comic book. Marvel has made him an adversary against Blade, which was perfect in the comics. Not so much in the movie, at least the execution. Hopefully with the announcement of a new Blade and the casting of Dracula in the MCU, maybe they'll do a better job. I have a theory that the MCU is going to make him one of the big bads, since they're going more supernatural. I like the character as a child. Seeing him as a villain, that has to be stopped, and that good men will always be there to stop him. So I guess that means I'm a Van Helsing fan as well. But in pop culture, we hear more about Dracula. He still has all the products, whether it's good or bad. Some stuff has really made Dracula more of a joke at times.
We've got Dracula lunchboxes. Did you see those? There's bobbleheads, keychains. This is funny.
That garlic gets me every time.
We've got just about anything.
But somehow the character has remained strong. I guess he can't keep a good vampire down. Like in most stories, Dracula keeps coming back again and again. You are probably wondering to yourself, isn't this a film channel? Don't you review movies? I haven't mentioned a Dracula movie in this, but fear not. I am going to review various Dracula movies in the next few days. Mainly hitting the big ones. If I did every single Dracula movie, I would be doing this for a long time. I could do this every day for a year and probably still not hit every single movie. This will lead up to a review of Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Since this year is also the 30th anniversary of that film, and I may do one or two more reviews after that. So look forward to that in the next few days. As for now, thank you for watching my video, and happy Halloween!